The Federal Aviation Administration just shut down Alaska's largest airport after a catastrophic midair engine failure involving an Alaska Airlines Boeing.
We do know that these incidents are extremely rare. We also know that planes are built to withstand depressurization.
Flight 558 had just taken off from Seattle when the left engine stopped working. Thankfully, the crew managed to land safely.
We want to thank the actions of the flight crew. That was equally heroic. The flight crew entirely did an excellent job.
But what investigators found later was even more alarming. Could this be another major safety issue for Boeing? And what does this mean for air travel safety? Join us as we expose the shocking details of this midair catastrophe.
Center Alaska, Trouble 2, we're declaring emergency. We're descending down to 10,000. 50 seconds.
Alaska Airlines Flight 558. It all started on an ordinary morning at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Passengers moved through the terminal, checking their bags, grabbing coffee, and preparing for their flights. Among them were the 176 travelers booked on Alaska Airlines Flight 558, a routine flight to San Diego. The Boeing 737-900ER stood ready at the gate, its engines humming in anticipation of takeoff. The crew was experienced and well-trained, and they performed their pre-flight checks with precision. Everything appeared normal. The weather was clear, air traffic was moving smoothly, and there was no sign of trouble. The aircraft taxied onto the runway as passengers settled into their seats, some happily headed for vacations, others preparing for work trips. At exactly 7:36 a.m., the plane accelerated, its engines roaring as it lifted off the ground. The initial climb was smooth, just as it should be. Seatbelt signs remained on, and the familiar hum of the engines filled the cabin. There was nothing unusual, at least not yet. Unknown to them, this flight will remain unforgettable in the history of modern aviation. Keep watching to find out why. Just a few minutes into the flight, something changed. A vibration rippled through the aircraft. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a faint tremor that could easily be mistaken for the usual turbulence. Some passengers likely assumed it was just the plane adjusting to the air currents. But as the aircraft continued to climb, that gentle shake became stronger. It was no longer something that could be ignored. Inside the cockpit, the flight crew immediately sensed the change. Pilots are trained to detect even the slightest irregularities which need attention. They carefully monitored the controls, checking for any sign of what might be causing the disturbance. Engine vibrations are not unheard of, but they are always taken seriously. Meanwhile, passengers started noticing the shaking more clearly. It was not the kind of turbulence that comes and goes. This felt different, more mechanical, and more persistent. Some travelers exchanged nervous stirs, while others gripped their armrests tighter. Flight attendants moved through the cabin with reassuring smiles, watching everyone while maintaining their routines. Remember that they've been trained to remain calm under pressure. As the aircraft reached 10,000 feet, the tremors became more serious. The sound of the engines had become more disturbing. In the cockpit, the pilots were running through their checklists, trying to determine the source of the problem. Engine issues were always possible, and they knew they had to be cautious. The safety of everyone on board depended on their ability to make the right decisions. The vibrations did not go away. Instead, they continued to grow. By the time Flight 558 reached cruising altitude, the shaking had become significant enough that it was impossible to keep going. It was no longer just a question of whether there was an issue. It was a matter of figuring out how serious it was. Passengers were beginning to sense that something was wrong. The flight, which had started so smoothly, now carried an air of uncertainty. Some tried to distract themselves with in-flight entertainment, while others looked around the cabin, searching for reassurance in the faces of fellow travelers. The flight attendants maintained their professionalism, though they too were waiting for more information. Then something happened that changed everything from bad to horrible. The vibrations, which had been disturbing but manageable, intensified suddenly. The plane's left side shook harder than before, and a loud, unnatural sound could be heard over the usual background noise of the flight. It was the kind of sound that did not belong and made people sit up straight and pay attention. Inside the cockpit, the crew had reached a decision. This was not a minor issue. Something was wrong with the left engine, and continuing to fly without addressing it would be risky. The safest option was to turn back. As the plane continued, passengers remained unaware of what was happening. There was no official announcement yet, and there was no confirmation of trouble, but they could feel it. What happened next would confirm their fears. The moment of realization was near. The real test for the pilots, crew, and passengers was about to begin. We are about to reveal the moment the situation reaches a critical point. What exactly went wrong with the engine? And how did the crew respond as the emergency unfolded in the sky? The answers are just ahead. Keep watching. Crew's response and emergency maneuvers. Inside the cockpit, Captain Miller and his co-pilot worked with sharp focus. Years of training had prepared them for emergencies like this, but facing an actual engine failure mid-flight was a test of skill, composure, and quick decision-making. The left engine had never shown any sign of trouble before, but they knew that if the situation continued, it could result in catastrophic failure and a fatal outcome. God forbid, the death of almost 200 souls vanished in a moment. Their priority was to stabilize the aircraft. The pilots reduced power to the struggling engine to prevent further damage, while increasing thrust slightly on the right engine to compensate. Every movement had to be precise. Any sudden adjustments could destabilize the plane. At the same time, the pilots needed to communicate with air traffic control. They quickly declared an emergency. Just when they were about to run out of patience, the captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and steady. Miller informed everyone that they had encountered an issue with one of the engines and, as a precaution, they would be returning to Seattle. He reassured them that the aircraft was designed to fly with a single engine if necessary, and that they completely controlled the situation. According to some passengers who later addressed the media, a few travelers who had experienced flights with technical issues tried to remain composed but knew that an emergency return was never routine. But thanks to the professionalism of the flight attendants, they moved through the cabin, ensuring everyone remained seated with fastened seatbelts. Their expertise helped keep panic at bay, although they also had concerns on their faces. They had been trained for these scenarios, but experience had taught them that every emergency was different. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the pilots were making critical decisions. Flying on a single engine changed the entire balance of the aircraft. It required constant adjustments to maintain altitude and heading. The plane could still fly, but wouldn't be as smooth or responsive as before. Eventually, Captain Miller initiated the descent earlier than usual. Under normal circumstances, returning to the airport would involve a standard, gradual approach. But with the ongoing vibrations and the risk of a complete engine failure, the pilots knew they had to get the plane on the ground as quickly as possible. But that is where the story gets more interesting. As the aircraft began its descent, the left engine continued to deteriorate. The shaking became more erratic. It still provided minimal thrust, but there was no way to know how long it would last. It failed, and they had no choice but to shut it down entirely. But if it falls, it could cause debris to break off and damage other aircraft parts. That's a situation nobody wants to see. The pilots discussed their options. Shutting down the engine would reduce the violent shaking, but it would also mean relying entirely on the right engine. With careful coordination, they decided to keep the left engine running at idle power, just enough to keep its components from completely shutting down, while relying mainly on the right engine for thrust. Down below, air traffic control had alerted emergency response teams at the airport. Fire trucks, ambulances, and ground crews were positioned along the runway, prepared for the possibility of an emergency landing. The situation was still under control, but it was standard procedure to have a backup in place. As the plane descended further, the cabin remained tense. Passengers knew they were heading back, but they also knew that landing was the most critical part of any emergency flight. The flight attendants calmly walked through the aisles, reminding everyone to remain seated and review the emergency landing procedures in the seatback pocket. Some passengers followed along, while others stared straight ahead, waiting for the ordeal to end. The final approach was a challenging moment for the pilots. The shaking had reached a point affecting their visibility and control. They remained stable, but any last-minute complications could make the landing dangerous. The runway was now in sight. This was the moment that would determine whether the emergency was indeed truly under control or whether it would escalate into something worse. The landing gear deployed, locking into place with a reassuring thud. The pilots made their final calculations, ensuring they had the best possible angle for a smooth landing. They had to be capable of a too-rough ding that could put additional strain on the already compromised engine. The plane touched down. The pilots engaged the brakes and reverse thrust to slow the aircraft. Despite the violent shaking earlier in the flight, the landing was smooth. The plane rolled down the runway, gradually losing speed until it finally came to a complete stop. For a moment, there was silence, Then the tension in the cabin disappeared. Some passengers clapped, while others took a deep breath, grateful to be on solid ground. The flight attendants moved quickly, preparing to assist in case of an emergency evacuation, but the aircraft remained intact. There was no fire, no smoke, just a plane that had successfully made an emergency landing. Outside, emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft. Ground crews quickly assessed the situation to ensure no immediate dangers before signaling it was safe to disembark. Inside the cockpit, Captain Miller and his co-pilot were planning to exit. The hardest part was over. They had returned the aircraft safely, but the job wasn't done yet. They needed to document everything that had happened, and most importantly, they needed to find out what had caused the engine to malfunction in the first place. As passengers gathered their belongings, some still shaken, others just relieved, airline mechanics were already approaching the aircraft to begin their inspection. The pilots knew that an engine failure like this couldn't be ignored. Was it a maintenance issue, a mechanical defect, or something far more serious? The investigation was just beginning, and what they were about to uncover would change everything you thought you knew about aviation. National Transportation Safety Board investigation. The immediate danger had passed, but for investigators, the real work was just beginning. The National Transportation Safety Board wasted no time in launching an inquiry.
We're here to conduct a safety investigation, but why it happened and how it happened.
Engine failures in modern commercial aircraft were rare, and when they did happen, they usually followed a predictable pattern. However, this incident had been different. Parts of the engine detached midair and fell over a populated area while Miller and the crew were trying to return to the airport. Investigators arrived at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport within hours. Their priority was securing the aircraft, ensuring that no further damage or tampering occurred before a forensic engine examination could occur. So the airport first placed the plane out of service. The two pilots had over 32 years of flying experience, so there was no immediate question about the crew's competence. However, securing the aircraft was just the first step. Investigators also needed to collect every possible piece of debris that had fallen from the engine during the flight. The missing cowling, the outer shell that covers and protects the engine, had detached midair and landed in a residential area. Luckily, people around reported seeing falling metal debris, and authorities quickly responded to the reports of metal objects falling from the sky. A large portion of the engine cowling was found in a homeowner's yard, while smaller fragments were scattered across driveways, rooftops, and streets. Some residents had heard loud thuds as pieces hit their properties, but fortunately, no one had been injured. Investigators carefully mapped out the locations where debris had fallen, since the spread of the parts could provide clues about the failure sequence. They also requested surveillance footage from the airport to determine if the issue started before takeoff or after the plane became airborne. With the aircraft secured and the debris collected, the focus turned to the damaged engine. According to media reports, the airline's maintenance team assisted investigators in removing the debris for further examination. Engineers believe the failure originated inside the engine, particularly in the fan blades. These massive blades at the front of the engine pull in air and generate thrust, enduring extreme stress during flight. During the initial teardown, investigators identified a fractured fan blade, which appeared to be the leading cause of the failure. A closer analysis revealed metal fatigue, tiny cracks that had developed over time inside the material. These cracks often begin at a microscopic level and grow under repeated stress, eventually leading to a complete break. Modern aircraft undergo rigorous inspections, and fan blades are routinely tested using advanced techniques like ultrasonic scanning to detect hidden flaws. If this particular blade had failed, it suggested one of two possibilities. Either the inspection pro had missed an existing flaw, meaning there could be a weakness in how fan blades were tested, or the DA had developed rapidly between inspections. If the second scenario had been true, standard maintenance schedules would have been insufficient to catch emerging issues. While metal fatigue was the primary suspect, investigators also considered that an external factor might have contributed to the failure. For instance, some experts suggest that a foreign object had struck the engine during takeoff. The truth is that airports regularly inspect runways to ensure they are free of loose objects. But even a small bolt, rock, or chunk of ice could be sucked into an engine and worsen existing weaknesses. Another possibility was a bird strike, though radar scans from the airport showed no sign of birds in the area at the time of takeoff. The further the investigation, the more confusing it became, and something interesting happened. Investigators retrieved the aircraft's flight data recorder, which most people call the black box. This device recorded vital information about engine performance, cockpit actions, and aircraft vibrations leading up to the failure. The data confirmed that everything had been normal until a sudden increase in engine vibrations, consistent with when the fan blade fractured. This evidence reinforced the theory that the failure had been caused by pre-existing metal fatigue rather than an external impact. With the failure mechanism identified, attention turned to the aircraft's maintenance history. Airlines follow strict maintenance schedules, and critical components like fan blades undergo regular inspections. Investigators reviewed the aircraft's maintenance logs to determine when the engine was last serviced and whether any signs of wear had been noted. The airline provided full access to its records, and there was no indication that safety protocols had been ignored. The fractured blade had passed previous inspections, which meant that either the fatigue had developed in a way that went undetected or the current testing methods were not effective in spotting the early signs of failure. The aircraft manufacturer and engine supplier were brought into the investigation to gain further insight. The broken fan blade was sent to a specialized laboratory for in-depth analysis. Using electron microscopes and stress testing, experts examined the exact age of the fatigue cracks and how they had spread over time. If the findings revealed that the cracks had been growing for years, standard inspections did not detect early fatigue. However, if the damage had developed rapidly, it would suggest that airlines needed to adjust maintenance schedules to inspect engines more frequently. While the investigation was ongoing, the aviation industry was already preparing for the potential consequences. If metal fatigue had been responsible for this failure, it could mean that other engines of the same model were at risk. Regulators immediately issued safety bulletins advising airlines to conduct emergency inspections on similar engines. Some airlines voluntarily grounded their Boeing models as a precaution, unwilling to take any. However, no one expected the decision to shut down some operations at Alaska Airport. Keep watching to understand why this is important. Moves to avoid mid-air engine failures. According to aviation engineers, the failure of the engine demonstrates that airports must improve their inspection techniques. For instance, federal investigators want air to increase the frequency of ultrasonic testing on fan blades, even if it means temporarily taking aircraft out of service more often. Aside from that, they also suggest that Boeing must develop new materials or coatings that could better resist fatigue and extend the lifespan of fan blades. However, in a separate development, the Federal Aviation Administration is planning an automated monitoring system that could be installed in engines to detect early signs of fatigue before they reach dangerous levels. According to media reports, the Federal Aviation Administration also ordered urgent aircraft inspections with the same engine model that had failed midair. For those familiar with the aviation industry, the shutdown allowed for the inspections, a standard practice when such incidents happen. Although it is not as simple as it sounds, the airline was given little choice. Planes with similar engines had to undergo immediate checks, and any signs of wear or damage would mean grounding until the issue was resolved. Within hours of the FAA's directive, the airline announced it was voluntarily grounding several aircraft to conduct in-depth inspections. This was not just about regulatory compliance. It was about reassuring the public that safety was the airline's top priority. Passengers aboard the affected flight had already begun sharing their experiences, and the thought of flying on another compromised aircraft was scary. So grounding the planes was necessary to restore confidence. Here is the catch. It was no longer an Alaskan airline problem. This also meant that other airlines operating the same aircraft type and engine model had to do something. While no other mid-air failures had been reported, aviation safety depended on preventing disasters before they happened, not reacting after they struck. But that wasn't all. Other Boeing operators scrambled to inspect their fleets, causing tempo flight disruptions. For passengers, this meant delays and cancellations. But for aviation officials, the priority was ensuring no aircraft took off unless it was unquestionably safe. At the same time, the incident reopened public concern about aging aircraft components. Airlines operated under strict maintenance schedules, replacing parts long before they became risky, but this event exposed a potential gap. Could specific components be failing sooner than expected? And if so, were airlines waiting too long between inspections? Beyond the technical side of aviation, the incident also had financial and reputational consequences. Alaska Airlines faced intense media scrutiny. Several media reports questioned the airline's commitment to maintenance. Even though there was no immediate evidence of negligence, the damage to its reputation was unavoidable. For weeks after the incident, passengers expressed concerns about booking flights with the airline, even though its safety record remained strong. That was why Alaska Airlines grounded aircraft, cooperated with investigators, and remained transparent about inspections. Aviation analysts admit that the airline's action helped reduce some backlash, but rebuilding trust may take time. But Alaska may not be the biggest loser in this game. The biggest loser will shock you. Well, it appears it is Boeing. Remember that Boeing designed the engine in question. The engine involved in the failure had been widely used across different airlines, and now Boeing had to prove that it remained reliable. If the investigation revealed deeper issues, it could lead to costly design changes, retrofitting older engines, or even new regulations that affected how airlines maintain their fleets. Boeing already has problems with costly crashes involving their new MAX model. The Alaska Airlines Flight 558 is just a fraction of the company's growing list of safety concerns, as you will soon see. Growing concern about Boeing engines. Boeing was once a leader in global aviation, but sadly it has faced a series of crises that have damaged its reputation, weakened its financial standing, and left the company struggling to regain the trust of airlines, regulators, and passengers worldwide. The turning point in Boeing's downfall is the Alaska Airlines Flight 558 incident. It is something darker, more serious, and more bloody, the catastrophic crashes of the 737 MAX 8 aircraft. It started on October 29, 2018, when Lion Air Flight 610 plunged into the Java Sea, killing all 189 people on board. Just months later, on March 10, 2019, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 crashed minutes after takeoff, claiming another 157 lives. Investigators identified a fatal flaw in the aircraft's maneuvering characteristics augmentation system. Let's break it down. MCAS is an automated flight control feature that repeatedly forces the nose of the plane down due to faulty sensor data. Boeing had implemented MCAS to compensate for the aircraft's aerodynamic instability, inform pilots about the system, and provide adequate training. When the truth emerged, it became clear that Boeing had prioritized cost-cutting and rushed production over safety, setting the stage for one of the biggest scandals in aviation history. 737 MAX fleets were grounded worldwide for nearly 2 years, and Boeing fell into a financial tailspin, with multiple lawsuits and compensation. That is not all. Production halts also drained billions from the company. Though the aircraft was eventually cleared to return to service, the damage to Boeing's credibility was irreversible. While the 737 MAX crisis was devastating, it was far from Boeing's only issue. The company's problems extended beyond commercial aviation into manufacturing and space exploration. The 787 Dreamliner suffered from serious structural flaws. In 2020, production defects forced Boeing to halt deliveries and delay orders. Industry sources admit that the delays frustrated airlines that had bet on the aircraft for long-haul operations. The 777X, a wide-body aircraft intended to compete with Airbus A350, also faced multiple delays. Boeing expected it to enter service in 2020. However, the time has been repeatedly pushed back due to structural failures, design issues, and stricter certification requirements. In November 2024, a major structural failure during testing led to further delays, adding to Boeing's growing list of setbacks. Meanwhile, the company's defense and space divisions were also struggling. The Starliner spacecraft, designed to compete with SpaceX and NASA's Commercial Crew program, faced repeated test failures and safety concerns, delaying its ability to transport astronauts to the International Space Station. The cumulative effect of these failures has taken a severe toll on Boeing's financial performance. The company has suffered billions in losses, with its stock price plummeting as investors lose confidence in its ability to recover. The 737 MAX crisis alone resulted in an estimated $20 billion in direct costs, including legal settlements, regulatory fines, and airline compensation for grounded fleets. Additionally, Boeing has lost significant ground to Airbus, its main competitor. Industry data reveal that Airbus has capitalized on Boeing's missteps by securing massive orders for its A320neo and A350 aircraft. In 2023 and 2024, Airbus consistently outpaced Boeing in deliveries and new aircraft orders, forcing airlines to reconsider their reliance on Boeing jets. Boeing's quality control failures have only added to concerns about its future. In January 2025, Another Alaska Airlines Boeing 737 veered off a taxiway at Alaska's major airport during a maintenance procedure. The incident occurred when two airline mechanics repositioned the aircraft to a parking location. According to U.S. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy, Boeing has lost the trust of the American public, and the company's production processes would remain under strict federal scrutiny. Investigators also believe that Boeing had relied heavily on outsourcing, which has weakened its quality and supply chain. According to media reports, Alaska Airlines has placed orders for more Boeing, despite the accidents. However, whether the orders will go ahead is unclear due to fears surrounding Boeing's quality control. The airline hasn't ordered any Airbus planes, but is set to receive several Boeing aircraft in the future. This year alone, it plans to add 14 new 737 MAX jets to its fleet and take delivery of 3 787-9 Dreamliners. Reports also suggest that Alaska procured 52 Boeing 737 MAX aircraft and increased its fleet from 94 to 146. And let's be honest, the whole industry has also seen a troubling surge in safety incidents this year. According to reports, 6 major aviation disasters occurred within 6 weeks in the United States alone this year. An American Airlines jet caught fire in Denver, while a Delta plane crash-landed at Toronto Pearson International Airport, injuring passengers and raising new concerns about aircraft reliability. Not all of these incidents are linked to Boeing of Alaska Airlines, but we need stronger regulatory oversight and more rigorous safety checks. If Boeing does not take aggressive steps to improve the safety of its products, there is no doubt that airline operators like Alaska Airlines will switch to other products like Airbus. Airlines, regulators, and passengers are watching closely, and Boeing cannot afford another disaster. The aviation industry is built on once that trust is lost, it is nearly impossible to regain. Thank you for staying with us. Do you believe Captain Miller made the right decision for Alaska Airlines Flight 558? Share your opinions with us in the comment section. If you enjoyed the video, like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Also, click the following video on your screen, and you will enjoy it.